January 1943. Tokyo. A winter rain taps softly against the windows of the Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry. Inside, the air is heavy. Officers stand in silence as casualty lists are read aloud, names of ships, names of pilots. Crews lost at sea before their bodies could be recovered. Black ribbons still hang in some offices, mourning rituals not yet concluded. Then another report arrives, across the Pacific, in American shipyards stretching from California to the Gulf Coast. Steel hulls are sliding into the water at a pace no one in this room believed possible. Ships sunk only months earlier have already been replaced. Aircraft destroyed in battle are rolling off assembly lines in numbers that feel unreal. A senior staff officer lowers his eyes. Another clenches his jaw. For the first time since the war began, the unthinkable is spoken aloud in guarded tones. The enemy is not just rebuilding. The enemy is accelerating. Japan's strategy had depended on time, shock, and decisive blows, but time itself now appears to belong to someone else. And to understand how this moment came to pass, the story must move backward into the assumptions, decisions, and industrial realities that shaped the war before the first bombs ever fell, before the war began. Japan's leaders believed they understood the balance of power. Throughout the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy studied the United States carefully. Its admirals read American journals, tracked naval appropriations, and followed debates in Washington. What they saw appeared reassuring. Isolationism dominated U.S. politics. Defense budgets rose and fell with elections. Congress argued. Production moved slowly. America, they concluded, lacked the will for a long war in the Western Pacific. Japan's own situation was starkly different. By the late 1930s, the empire was already at war. Since 1937, Japanese forces had been fighting in China, consuming men, fuel, and industrial output. Steel, oil, rubber, and aluminum were scarce. Japan imported the majority of its raw materials, much of it from territories controlled or influenced by Western powers. Any prolonged conflict risked strangulation. This reality shaped Japanese strategy at every level. The Imperial Navy knew it could not outbuild the United States. Even on paper, the numbers were unfavorable. In 1940, American steel production exceeded Japan's by more than 10 times. U.S. automobile factories alone produced more engines annually than Japan's entire heavy industry sector. Japanese planners did not deny these facts, they worked around them. The solution, they believed, was speed. Japanese naval doctrine centered on the idea of contesting the decisive fleet battle. If Japan could strike first, destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and seize a defensive perimeter rich in resources, Washington would face a grim calculation: rebuild and fight across thousands of miles, or negotiate a settlement that recognized Japan's new empire. Pearl Harbor was designed to be that opening blow. On December 7, 1941, the attack achieved its immediate tactical goals. Battleships burned, aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The Pacific Fleet was temporarily paralyzed. In Tokyo, confidence surged. The early months of war seemed to confirm everything Japan's planners had hoped. Hong Kong fell. Singapore surrendered. The Philippines collapsed. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, were seized. Japanese forces advanced faster than any Western power had imagined possible. Yet beneath the victories, strain was already visible. Japan's shipyards were working at maximum capacity, but they were small and specialized. Each warship was effectively custom-built, requiring skilled labor and long construction times. Losses could not be replaced quickly. Aircraft production faced similar limits. Japan produced high-quality planes, but in limited numbers, with little standardization between models. American production, by contrast, had not yet fully awakened. In 1941, the United States was already preparing for war, even before Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had pushed through rearmament programs, expanded shipbuilding contracts, and approved massive aircraft orders. But much of this effort was still in transition. Factories were converting, workers were training. Output had not yet peaked. To Japanese intelligence officers, this lag reinforced optimism. They believed America's industrial power was real but slow. It would take years, they thought, before U.S. factories could translate potential into overwhelming force. Japan needed only a narrow window 6 months to a year to secure its position. That belief rested on a critical assumption: that American industry, like Japanese industry, required time to mourn its losses. This assumption would soon prove fatal, because in the United States, war production was not shaped by tradition or scarcity, but by scale, standardization, and a political decision that would redefine modern warfare. And as Japan pressed forward in early 1942, the machinery of American industry was already shifting into a form no Axis power had ever faced before. The attack on Pearl Harbor did not shock American industry into motion. It removed the last restraints holding it back. On December 8, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States in return. What followed was not confusion, but coordination. Years of planning often dismissed as theoretical were activated at once. In January 1942, the War Production Board was established under the authority of the President. Its mandate was sweeping. Civilian manufacturing would be redirected. Materials would be rationed. Contracts would be standardized. Speed would override elegance. Quantity would matter as much as quality. American factories were not asked to build perfect machines. They were asked to build enough. Automobile plants in Detroit stopped producing cars and began producing aircraft engines, tanks and trucks. Refrigerator manufacturers turned out machine gun parts. Typewriter companies built fire control equipment. Across the country, production lines were redesigned to minimize downtime and maximize output. Shipbuilding revealed the clearest contrast between the two sides. Before the war, building a merchant ship in the United States could take more than a year. By 1942, American engineers reimagined the process. Hull sections were prefabricated inland, shipped by rail, and welded together at coastal yards. Skilled craftsmen were replaced, where possible, by standardized procedures that could be taught quickly. The Liberty ship became the symbol of this transformation. It was not fast, it was not elegant, but it could be built in weeks instead of months. In some cases, the time from keel laying to launch dropped below 40 days. By 1943, the United States was producing merchant ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Naval warships followed a similar pattern. Aircraft carriers were no longer rare, irreplaceable assets. New classes were designed with modular construction in mind. Destroyers, escorts, and landing ships rolled off production lines in steady streams. Losses were recorded, analyzed, and absorbed, not mourned. Aircraft production reached numbers that strained belief. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 6,000 military aircraft. In 1942, that number exceeded 47,000. By 1944, it would surpass 96,000. Models were standardized. Parts were interchangeable. Training programs expanded to ensure a continuous flow of pilots and mechanics. Japanese intelligence received these reports slowly and unevenly. Some officers dismissed them as exaggerations. Others believed the figures but assumed logistical chaos would blunt their impact. A few, quietly, began to grasp the implications. For the first time, Japan faced an enemy whose losses did not reduce its future strength. This realization sharpened after the battles of 1942. At Coral Sea and Midway, Japan lost experienced pilots and irreplaceable carriers. The United States lost ships as well, but replacements were already under construction. At Guadalcanal, attrition became relentless. Planes were shot down, ships damaged, crews exhausted. The Japanese Navy could fight brilliantly, but it could not fight endlessly. By late 1942, reports from the front told a disturbing story. American units returned to combat with new equipment. New aircraft types appeared in the skies. New ships joined task forces faster than Japanese planners had projected. Each engagement hinted at a deeper imbalance. Japan had hoped to force a decisive negotiation before American strength fully emerged. Instead, the war was becoming something else entirely, a contest not just of fleets and pilots, but of factories, schedules, and raw tonnage. And within that contest, the human experience of command, the way leaders understood, resisted, and finally accepted this reality would shape the war's next phase. That perspective now demands closer examination. For Japan's senior naval officers, the war had always been personal. Many had studied in the United States. They had lived in American cities, attended American institutions, and observed American society firsthand. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself had spent years in Washington and Harvard. He understood American industrial capacity better than most. Yet even he believed that shock and speed might compensate for imbalance. By late 1942, that belief was eroding. Inside command meetings, the tone changed. Loss reports were no longer framed as temporary setbacks. They accumulated. Pilots lost at Midway and Guadalcanal could not be replaced with equal experience. Training pipelines were too slow. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Young aviators were sent into combat with fewer hours than their predecessors. The emotional toll was visible. Officers recorded frustration and exhaustion in private diaries. Some expressed disbelief that American forces could return so quickly after defeats. Others spoke of a growing sense of inevitability, a war that no longer felt winnable, only survivable. Japan's naval doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. Ships were heavily armed. Crews were highly trained. Night fighting tactics were refined to a level unmatched early in the war. But these advantages assumed limited engagements. Attrition warfare was never part of the plan. The United States, by contrast, adapted quickly. Tactics were revised to preserve pilots and ships. Engagements were chosen carefully. Losses were accepted when necessary, knowing replacements were available. Over time, this asymmetry became decisive. Each Japanese loss weakened future operations. Each American loss became a data point, not a crippling blow. Japan built exceptional machines, but built them slowly. Aircraft models changed frequently, complicating maintenance and supply. Spare parts were often unique. Production runs were small. American aircraft, meanwhile, were designed with mass production in mind. Standardized components allowed faster repairs and quicker training. Radar, communications, and logistics steadily tilted the balance further. Technology alone did not decide the war, but when combined with industrial scale, it amplified every American advantage. And as these angles converged, Japanese leaders were forced to confront a deeper question. How long could skill and sacrifice hold back a system designed for endurance? That question would grow more urgent as the war moved toward its most decisive phase. At the highest levels of Japanese command, recognition came slowly and painfully. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned before the war that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that he foresaw no confidence. His death in April 1943 removed one of the few voices willing to confront uncomfortable truths directly. Those who remained were often bound by institutional loyalty and cultural restraint. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, received increasingly bleak production summaries. Ship losses were tallied against construction schedules that could not keep pace. Requests for resources competed with the Army, which was itself stretched across China and Southeast Asia. Decisions became reactive rather than strategic. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo faced a similar dilemma. Publicly, confidence had to be maintained. Privately, reports acknowledged that American industrial output had exceeded worst-case estimates. The war was no longer about achieving advantage, it was about delaying collapse long enough to seek an opening that might never come. Leadership, once decisive and assertive, became constrained by reality. From the American perspective, the war was understood differently. U.S. planners viewed the conflict as a long industrial struggle from the outset. The objective was not immediate victory, but sustained pressure. Admiral Ernest King and General George C. Marshall emphasized logistics, production, and training as much as battlefield success. American losses were openly discussed, analyzed, and planned for. Replacement schedules were integrated into operational planning. When ships were sunk, new hulls were already assigned to future task forces. When pilots were lost, training programs expanded rather than contracted. This approach drained Japanese morale in subtle ways. Battles that should have created strategic breathing room instead produced fresh American formations weeks later. For Japanese commanders, the realization carried moral weight. The Imperial Navy had been built on the idea of honor, sacrifice, and decisive action. To fight an enemy whose strength grew with every blow felt fundamentally disorienting. Sacrifice no longer guaranteed progress. Courage no longer translated into advantage. Some officers recorded moments of quiet despair. Others hardened themselves, embracing fatalism. The belief that Japan was fighting against mathematics, not just men, spread through staff offices and frontline units alike. The war had become impersonal. Assembly lines replaced battle plans. And the emotional cost of this shift of realizing that bravery could not compensate for imbalance reshaped how Japan fought the rest of the war. By early 1943, these angles converged into a single understanding within Japanese command circles. The conflict had passed a point of return. What followed was not sudden defeat, but a turning point marked by specific battles, specific numbers, and moments when reality could no longer be softened by hope. That turning point now comes into focus. The Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942, remains the first clear sign that Japan's assumptions had failed. Admiral Yamamoto's plan called for a decisive blow, a trap designed to lure the American fleet into a confrontation where Japanese carriers would dominate. Intelligence suggested that the U.S. Pacific Fleet was scattered, weakened, and slow to respond. Confidence in Japan's operational planning was high. Victory seemed imminent, but reality unfolded differently. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes. Task forces were positioned to anticipate the strike. Dive bombers found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, planes fueled. Decks crowded, crews still preparing for attacks. In a matter of hours, 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were destroyed. Experienced pilots and aircrew, carefully trained over years, were gone. For the Japanese command, the shock was twofold. Not only had they lost irreplaceable men and ships, but the losses were not permanent for the Americans. The U.S. carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, would be repaired, rebuilt, and replaced faster than Japan could imagine. Meanwhile, Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943, exposed the limits of Japan's industrial reach. The Solomon Islands became a grinding war of attrition. Japanese troops and pilots fought fiercely. Naval forces attempted nightly resupply runs, the Tokyo Express, to sustain positions against a growing American presence. Losses mounted. Battleships were damaged, destroyers sunk, aircrews expended. Every tactical victory came with a cost that Japan could ill afford. American forces, in contrast, rotated units and supplied reinforcements with industrial certainty. New aircraft arrived faster than they could be shot down. Replacement ships appeared while Japanese commanders were still mourning the last engagement. By late 1942, the arithmetic was undeniable. Japan could win engagements, but could not win the war of production. Every ship sunk by Americans would eventually be replaced. Every pilot lost could be matched by a newly trained one, flying a plane built in a standardized assembly line. In Tokyo, command rooms fell silent as reports were compiled. Yamamoto had anticipated a battle of skill and daring. Instead, he faced a war of scale and endurance. The American industrial machine was a force he could not outwit, and Japan's pride and experience offered no counter. And yet, the most damning confirmation would come in early 1943, when shipyards, aircraft factories, and training programs revealed the true scale of the imbalance, a truth that would reverberate through every Japanese command decision in the months to follow. By January 1943, the scale of American industrial output was impossible to ignore. Shipyard reports showed Liberty ships launched faster than Japan could sink them. The U.S. Navy had replaced its early 1942 losses in months, while Japan's own fleet struggled to keep even a single carrier operational. Destroyers, critical for escorting convoys, were mass-produced at a pace Tokyo could not match. Even losses in minor skirmishes now had strategic consequences as the gap widened with every passing week. Aircraft told the same story. Japanese pilots trained for years were being lost in battles over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. Their replacements were often rushed, yet the Americans replaced their experienced aviators with fully trained personnel from a rapidly expanding pool. The U.S. had already produced tens of thousands of planes by early 1943. With more in production than Japan could dream of in a year, fuel shortages magnified the problem. Japan's war machine relied on imported oil, now cut off by American submarine campaigns. Ships and aircraft might exist, but without fuel, they were dead weight. Meanwhile, the U.S. exploited its secure domestic production, ensuring fleets and planes could move where needed without interruption. Within Japanese command circles, a psychological rupture began. Reports circulated showing not just parity, but American advantage. Battles that were supposed to weaken the enemy only highlighted Japan's own fragility. Admiring American ingenuity no longer sufficed. Despair replaced hope. In Tokyo, officers wept silently over lost reports, not just for the men, but for the impossible arithmetic of war. Steel and engines, machines and factories now outweighed courage and training. Each report from American yards, each tally of Liberty ships and replacement aircraft, confirmed a chilling reality. Japan could no longer match the enemy in a contest of resources. The war had changed. It was no longer measured in individual skill or tactical brilliance. It was measured in tonnage, production schedules, and the relentless churn of industry. Japan's command understood the bitter truth. No victory, however bold, could overcome this industrial tide. And this realization, painful, silent, and irrefutable, would define every subsequent decision, every strategic withdrawal, and every desperate gamble Japan made across the Pacific. The consequences of this imbalance, in both human and strategic terms, now come into focus. By mid-1943, Japan's strategic position had shifted from offense to defense. The losses at Midway and Guadalcanal had already thinned experienced personnel. Now, the relentless pace of American production made recovery impossible. Ships sunk in battle were replaced within weeks. Aircraft destroyed in the skies returned as new squadrons in larger numbers. Japan's industrial limitations, small shipyards, limited raw materials, and a lack of standardized production meant that no amount of tactical skill could restore parity. The Imperial Navy began to prioritize survival over conquest. Offensive operations were limited to high-value targets, calculated to inflict maximum damage with minimal risk. Carrier task forces were preserved rather than committed to decisive engagements. The Army, stretched thin across China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands, faced similar constraints. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had been reduced by American submarine campaigns. Ships sat idle. Aircraft remained grounded. Training hours for pilots dwindled. Reports from the front painted a grim picture. Japanese officers recorded the emotional strain of repeated defeats, compounded by a growing awareness that the enemy could absorb losses that Japan could not. Diaries reveal phrases such as, "The tide cannot be stemmed," and "We fight against steel." Not men, morale suffered quietly, the psychological weight of an industrially superior adversary pressing on every decision. Meanwhile, American strategy leveraged this imbalance. Task forces rotated crews efficiently. Aircraft carriers repaired in months, not years, returned to battle. Production schedules anticipated losses, ensuring that the material cost of war did not slow operations. By the autumn of 1943, the United States had launched more ships and aircraft than Japan had in its entire Navy and Army combined. Japanese command began to acknowledge the irreversible disparity. Strategic discussions increasingly revolved around delay and attrition rather than expansion. Battles became defensive, resources conserved, and hope deferred. Yet even in this constrained posture, Japan's officers maintained courage and discipline, confronting an enemy that had turned industry itself into a weapon of war. The scale of the imbalance now dictated every decision: when to fight, when to withdraw, and which battles were worth the human cost. By late 1943, the consequences of America's industrial supremacy were undeniable. In the Pacific, Japanese forces were increasingly on the defensive. Island garrisons, once part of a strategy to extend Japan's perimeter, now struggled to hold positions against an enemy whose strength grew faster than their losses. Guadalcanal was a warning. The Philippines, New Guinea, and the Solomons soon followed as theaters where Japan was forced to react rather than dictate events. Shipbuilding statistics revealed the stark reality. From 1942 to 1943, the United States launched over 1,000 new vessels, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and amphibious ships. Japan's production, hampered by shortages of steel, skilled labor, and fuel, could not match even a fraction of this output. For every Japanese ship lost, multiple American replacements appeared in the theater of operations, steadily eroding Japan's ability to sustain offensive campaigns. Air superiority followed the same pattern. The U.S. Army, Air Forces, and Navy trained thousands of new pilots annually. By mid-1943, American aircraft could dominate the skies in critical campaigns, while Japan struggled to replace its seasoned aviators. This imbalance forced Japanese commanders to rely on attritional tactics, defensive positions, and kamikaze-style desperation. Attacks a harbinger of the strategy that would define the final years of the Pacific War, reports from Japanese intelligence now confirmed what had long been feared. The enemy was no longer vulnerable to shock attacks or single decisive battles. The war had transformed into a contest of endurance and production. Every American convoy, every new aircraft, every ship launched, was a tangible reminder of Japan's inability to recover at the same pace. The human cost compounded the strategic dilemma. Crews, pilots, and soldiers faced relentless pressure, fighting against an enemy whose losses did not reduce its effectiveness. Morale, discipline, and honor remained. But the knowledge that industrial scale had replaced battlefield skill as the decisive factor weighed heavily on every command decision. By early 1944, the trajectory was clear. Japan was no longer in control of its fate. The American industrial machine had replaced losses before mourning could end, reshaping the war and forcing the Japanese command to confront the inexorable reality. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The war's outcome and the lessons of this industrial imbalance lead directly into a moment of reflection on humanity, strategy, and the nature of modern warfare. The story of Japan's command weeping over American industrial output is more than a tale of ships and planes. It is a lesson in the transformation of war itself. By 1943, courage, skill, and tactical brilliance could no longer dictate outcomes alone. Victory was measured in tons of steel, in hours on assembly lines, in the speed with which losses could be replaced. Modern warfare had become a contest not just of men, but of machines and of the societies that built them. The Pacific conflict revealed that industrial capacity was a weapon in its own right, shaping strategy, morale, and even the decisions of seasoned commanders. The human mind, no matter how disciplined, struggled to contend with an opponent whose strength was defined by production schedules rather than bravery. For Japan, the realization was profound and tragic. The war they envisioned short, decisive, honorable was replaced by a war of attrition, exhaustion, and inevitability. The men who had trained for decisive battles found themselves fighting against a tide that could not be stemmed. Yet, amid despair, they demonstrated courage and discipline, confronting an enemy whose advantage was both material and relentless. For history, the lesson endures. Industrial power can transform strategy, reshape the battlefield, and redefine human expectation. Modern warfare is as much about factories as it is about fleets. And in the silent command rooms of Tokyo, where reports arrived faster than they could mourn, the human cost of this reality was written not in words, but in the quiet resignation of a command facing a machine it could not match. The war continued. But the story of that moment, the understanding that the enemy could replace losses before mourning ended, remains a stark testament to the new rules of global conflict and to the profound intersection of human will and industrial might.